9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR Podcast. Hello and welcome to DSR. This is our weekly show when we get together with our friends who also happen to be some of the smartest people we know, and we talk about what's going on in the world. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and I am joined today, as always, by Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center. How are you doing, Rosa?
Fantastic, David. Great apocalypse so far.
Great. How's the apocalypse going for you? And Kori Schake, who's got a positive outlook and will enjoy any apocalypse more than all the rest of us. Right, Kori?
I'm going to try and surf the apocalypse, David.
Surf? Yeah. Well, wasn't that Apocalypse Now where there was a great surfing scene where he says, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells of victory.
Charlie, don't surf.
Yeah.
Great tune.
Yeah, exactly. That's Apocalypse. And joining us also is our friend Ed Luce of the Financial Times. How are you doing, Ed?
Splendidly. I'm enjoying part 2 of the snow apocalypse.
Snow apocalypse. And Ed and I are dressed the same way. It's very... Actually, so's Rosa. I don't know what's going on with Kori. The three of
I
us
didn't get the memo, as usual.
Yeah, the black T-shirts. We're going for the Steve Jobs look here.
I thought it was the funereal look.
Yeah.
Well, it's that. I've got questions for each of you, but let me just start in no particular order. As we were about to come on the air, I heard you guys talking about Trump and Elon Musk's kid, Grimes's kid, in the Oval Office yesterday. I thought it was weird as heck. But Ed has done some writing about it, and I also saw him do some commenting about it. Did you think it was weird as heck, Ed?
Yeah, I did. And, it would be cute if it was anybody else, but this was a power flex by Musk that I can just bring my kid, put him on my shoulders in the Oval Office while Trump's sitting there. This was a statement of just, I own the place. But that was the least weird thing about that fateful 30 minutes. I mean, I watched, I was never that scared by movies like The Exorcist or Damien, but this I did find really quite frightening to watch and listen to Musk's stream of consciousness as he sort of scaled the peaks of, as somebody put it, the Dunning-Kruger mountain range. His overestimation of his IQ and knowledge about how government works and what democracy means in sort of quality of prose, let alone sort of underlying grasp of the substantive issues, but just the quality of his language would have embarrassed, a semi-literate stoner, as I put it in a post at the time. This was really, truly cringe-making stuff. Trump then sort of, to add to the weirdness of it, sitting there sort of mostly admiringly, but also sort of getting more and more irritated with 4-year-old X, who, was sort of chipping in every now and then and picking his nose very ostentatiously, and then being sort of hoisted onto Musk's shoulders, and then Musk sort of taking on and off his dark MAGA baseball cap and shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other and looking very like, to me, somebody who's under the influence of something. I mean, I know lots of people who don't take drugs, and I've known over the years people who do take drugs.
Yeah,
and he strikingly resembled the latter category of people, is all I can say. But this was awful. It was truly awful.
Kori, you usually have an upbeat view of the world. Did you see any of it? Do you have any reaction to it?
I am maintaining my upbeat sense of the world by not having watched it.
I see. So, well, okay. Well, we'll come back to you then with regard to something else. Rosa, did you watch it?
I didn't watch it. I just saw pictures and I read articles about it. but so I missed the whole kid blowing his nose on White House furniture part that Ed enjoyed so much.
Well, there's a little bit on the internet in which the kid is allegedly saying to Trump, "Shush."
I feel that I am right there with that kid, because I feel that way a lot when Trump speaks. I feel like saying "shush." So we do not blame this poor child one little bit, obviously, for being used as a prop to make the point that I'm just moving right in here at the Oval Office, and the children are in fact in charge of the country at the moment. I think it did illustrate that pretty well.
Okay. Well, let me just, as I said, I have several different things I'd like to talk about. Let me come back to you, Kori. We've had the King of Jordan visiting in the White House this week, and we've also had the President of the United States doubling down, even though the King of Jordan said, "I'm not going to accept the Palestinians that you want." President saying, "Yeah, we're going ahead." And he added a new little twist to this, which in the long history of really bad American policy, I think took us to a new level, which was he said, "We're going to own Gaza." It's like, oh, now the United States is going to do territorial expansion in the Middle East. Because, if you're looking for a neighborhood you want to expand into, let's go into the Middle East. And it really struck me that we're entering new territory because, we had the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war, Obama doing nothing in Syria. We've done all sorts of miserable things. Biden's Gaza policy was pretty terrible. But this is innovatively bad policy, isn't it, Kori?
I think that's a perfect description, David. Innovatively bad policy. The president of Egypt, who receives enormous amounts of military and intelligence aid from the United States, is refusing to come to our country and meet with the president of the United States as a result of the president saying that Egypt and Jordan will be forced to take Palestinian refugees. So in one fell swoop, he managed to make more brittle the government of Jordan and completely alienate the government of Egypt, the two countries whose relationships are deepest with the United States and most important for the security of Israel.
And he also said, Ed, if the hostages are all back on Saturday, then, all bets are off. Hell's going to break loose. You'll pay. Hamas is, of course, saying this guy's crazy. How can we possibly deal with this? But it sure doesn't look like the situation in Gaza, Israel, the Middle East is getting any more stable, does it?
No, I mean, I have to feel for Steve Witkoff, and not somebody who I would ordinarily champion, but Trump's envoy to the Middle East clearly did a good job before Trump was inaugurated, even in league with Brett McCurk, Biden's guy, to get the latest hostage release. And that was supposedly about a down payment on another hostage release. In the meantime, Trump has blown that out of the water. What on earth incentive would Hamas have to cede its remaining hostages? Its only real leverage. If Trump's going to ethnically cleanse their enclave and turn it into the Trump beach and oceanfront, Mediterranean front property for the Middle East. I mean, it's again, we've got a sort of surreal Alice in Wonderland competition going on here on many, many Trumpian fronts. But why would that be a good thing to do if you wanted to incentivize the end of the hostage stage of this chapter? I don't know.
No, it couldn't end well. It'd probably end up being called Merd a Lago. Rosa, other foreign policy developments today. We had Pete Hegseth weighing in on how the situation in Ukraine should be resolved. He said Ukraine shouldn't expect to get back the land that the Russians went in on and shouldn't expect to be part of NATO. And then Trump said he spoke, I think, both to Putin and to Zelensky, and that Putin has agreed to begin negotiations right away. And why shouldn't he, with Pete Hegseth doing the negotiating for him?
Yeah, I mean, none of this is unexpected, of course. Our assumption was that if Trump became president, as he now has, that he would put pressure on Ukraine to essentially cede the territory currently controlled by Russia, or something very close to that. And I think it'll be pressure that will be very hard for the Ukrainians to resist. I mean, obviously, without assistance from the U.S., even if Europe steps up, it's not clear how much longer they can hold out, and the price they have paid in money and damaged property and in human lives is unbelievably high already. So I think there will be enormous pressure on Zelensky to say, all right, and maybe there's some face saving, minor changes to territory, but, or some agreement that this all be revisited in 5 years or something like that. But I can't see a particularly happy outcome here for Ukraine. I think it's a terrific outcome for Vladimir Putin, who has been fighting a war that has also been incredibly costly to him, and not to mention to the Russian people, and who I think would like to have something that will look and he will perceive and will be perceived back in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia as a political victory. The Hegseth said that there should be troops monitoring the border. So he's making some vague noises about playing by the usual rules of international peace agreements. But I don't, this is a depressing outcome. It's made even more depressing, I would add, by the fact that, of course, Donald Trump is suggesting that the Ukrainians now owe us a whole lot of money because of how nice we were to them over the last few years, and that we should get all that money back in the form of, natural resources from the Ukrainians and rights to exploit those resources.
I see Kori taking short intakes of breath here. So,
yeah, I actually have a very different view than Rosa on this.
Is it more optimistic? Please.
I don't think Pete Hegseth said anything that was different from Biden administration policy in the last 9 months of the administration, at least. They had not one.
Wait a second. And you're saying that's a positive?
I'm not saying it's positive. I'm not saying I'm saying it's not a tragic departure from what was American policy. I mean, Biden had not one but two opportunities to bring Ukraine into NATO and declined on both. And for at least the last 9 months of the administration, the National Security Advisor and everybody else was saying, we're going to have to make trade-offs, time to bring the war to an end. So
that's a little bit different from what at least I understand Hegseth to be saying. I mean, saying they're going to have to be trade-offs with the war to end versus essentially you ain't getting what you want. Maybe I'm being too cynical. I'd love to, but I took Hegseth to mean any territory Russia currently controls is territory they're going to keep.
But again, how is that different from what the Biden administration was saying and doing? And on the Ukraine pay us back, I do have a different view on that. I actually think well-meaning people who are fearful that Trump will cut off all weapons assistance to Ukraine were desperately casting about for creative ways to keep aid flowing. And I don't know, maybe one of you guys do, how many years it took for Britain to repay the loans of American assistance for World War I and World War II. But I think it was in the 80s. And so saying we're not going to give Ukraine aid, we're going to trade it for something they have, we're going to make loans, I don't think that's unreasonable given the magnitude of assistance that's been provided to Ukraine and the very genuine risk that Trump would zero it out.
Yeah, and by the way, it does remind me, it does remind me a bit of the ploy used by Jim Jeffries and some others in Syria when Trump wanted to pull out altogether, and they said, but then we'll lose all the oil. And Trump was like, oh, yeah, maybe we shouldn't pull out. So it's a little bit of a page out of that book. Sorry, Ed, I didn't mean to interrupt.
But I agree with Rosa. I'm not saying it's going to produce a good outcome. I'm not saying it's what I think the policy should be. I'm just saying I don't think it's all that big a departure.
The only thing I wanted to just say is if Donald Trump was a different person and Pete Hegseth was a different person, I might think that. But given their pattern of behavior, I sort of attach the darkest possible meaning to their words, which is to say that I assume it's going to be not only as bad as they say, but even worse. So maybe I would love to be proven wrong. However, sorry, Ed, go ahead.
No, really, I forgot what I was going to say.
Now he's sulking.
Come on. I'm joking. I'm mock sulking. The point I was going to add is that, if Trump is coveting alleged critical minerals deposits in Ukraine, they are apparently mostly in the Donbass, which Russia occupies, which explains Zelensky's alacrity of saying, yeah, we could talk about that. So there are ways of playing on Jim Jeffries' Syria oil siren that in terms of seducing Trump here. But I do agree with Kori that there's no sort of rule that says you fund another country's war for free.
Yeah, and I by the way, I agree with Kori that the Biden administration wasn't that far from where we are on all of this either. And I would have been, because I would have said there's no good outcome to this war that doesn't end with Ukraine and NATO. But that's me. It's a different view.
And me.
Pardon me?
I was just endorsing your proposal.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad we agree on that. All right. So now we come to the portion of our program, and as we're in sort of the back half here, where I have to address the thing that's come up most frequently on the internet about this program, which is people saying, well, Rosa always says we're not in a constitutional crisis. For the past, X number of years, the whole prior Trump, and I go, is this a constitutional crisis? Rosa's like, no, this is not a constitutional crisis.
It's like an asymptote. Remember that from math where you get the line, it gets closer and closer and never quite gets there?
Well, yeah, it's what's called Rosa's paradox after Zeno's paradox, yes. Which does the same thing, right? But in any event, that's a mathematical reference there that I deserve some credit for. But in any event, thank you, everybody. The reason it's come up so much this week is that we seem to be at a moment where the administration is saying, okay, we're not going to listen to the court. And I don't know what you do in that situation. A Supreme Court justice this morning in Florida, Sonia Sotomayor, said, well, if they ignore the court now, the court's ruling still stands and it will stand in the future, which I thought was kind of like, what? It was like, that's not super comforting. But I think we're getting to a point where if they say we don't care about the system, then, all the responses to what they're doing that we would have normally used are mooted. And it leads one to ask, Rosa, are we in a constitutional crisis yet?
Not quite, David, but we're really, really close. So, here's the thing, right? On the one hand, here's the bad news and here's the good news. The bad news is that the Trump administration is doing quite a lot of illegal things. And the court injunctions that have been issued so far strongly suggest that courts agree that they're doing things of somewhere between questionable legality and straight out illegality in a number of cases. I think some of the cases are stronger than others, obviously. But certainly, at least on some of their actions, it seems pretty clearly unlawful. To take, for instance, not to speak of unconstitutional, take, for instance, birthright citizenship being the most obvious example of an executive order that attempts to do something that appears to be clearly and blatantly not just in violation of a statute, but in violation of the U.S. Constitution itself. And the Trump administration, however, has been only sort of kind of complying with court orders on things like the federal funding freeze, for instance, although federal judges have ordered the freeze to be paused. It's not particularly clear that the spigot has in fact been turned back on. And indeed, a judge in Rhode Island found that the Trump administration was not complying with the court order. So that's the bad news, that we have a situation in which we have the president and the executive branch doing things that look pretty blatantly unlawful, being told by judges, okay, we're going to have to look at this in detail, but for now you got to stop because it sure looks like you're doing something that's kind of unlawful, that's going to do irreparable harm to a lot of people, and they're not fully complying. And that's really, really bad. And that gets you right up to the brink of a constitutional crisis. You get even further, even closer to the brink when you've got nitwits like J.D. Vance tweeting things saying courts are not allowed to tell the president what to do, which started with several other idiotic statements. I think Yale Law School should revoke his diploma. The courts wouldn't be allowed to tell the military what to do. The courts are not allowed to tell prosecutors what to do. They're not allowed to tell the president what to do. And I thought, wait a minute, they do all of these things all the time. That is, in fact, exactly what courts do. That the courts interpret the law. And for more than 200 years, judicial review has been a core element of our constitutional structure, going back to Marbury versus Madison, a case that every law student in the United States reads in their first few weeks of law school. So that's really bad, that the executive branch is breaking the law. They're not complying with court orders telling them they need to stop. And the vice president of the United States and others are saying things like courts should not be allowed to do this. However, what they have not done, and this is what I think would clearly cross us over into constitutional crisis territory, they haven't said openly, and therefore, screw you, courts. We're not going to comply with your orders at all. In fact, thus far, despite the sort of postings on social media and occasional rhetoric, they are sort of kind of pretending that they're going to comply, that they are responding to courts saying, well, you didn't comply, by saying things like, oh, well, gee whiz, when you said comply, we didn't realize you meant comply. We thought you meant like sort of comply. And, we're going to file some more paperwork, and we're, that they're still working within the system. They're still appealing and so forth. Rather than overtly saying, you don't get to tell us what to do. We're not following your stinking order. That would clearly push us over. If we get to a point where we get the administration openly saying, shrugging, we're not doing this anymore, we don't care what you say, would be a clear constitutional crisis. I think in some ways the more dangerous situation, and the one that we're actually more likely to get in, is not one where they say overtly, we're not complying because we don't care. You don't get to be the boss of me, which would totally demolish our system of checks and balances, because obviously, the courts don't have an army. The courts rely on the executive branch to execute, to do stuff. And if the executive branch won't comply and Congress won't do anything, you might as well throw the whole thing out the window. But the more dangerous situation, and indeed the more likely one, is that they continue to do what they're doing, only more so, which is to say they continue to just not actually comply, or comply only in minor symbolic ways to pretend that they're complying, while in fact 90% of the time they are actively just ignoring or subverting court orders, while still saying, oh, but we are complying, or we just didn't quite understand you, or but we thought that this only applied to this, not that. That in some ways is far more dangerous, because that lets the cowardly members of Congress, they all know who they are, who don't want a confrontation, to continue to say, well, they're saying they're going to comply, without actually asserting any congressional power. It avoids a showdown, but in some ways it's actually more dangerous, because it hides what they in fact would be doing, which is a kind of slow motion constitutional crisis. And there I sort of don't quite know. I don't think there's like a clear point. How do you say, it's how many grains of sand make a heap? How many instances of clearly knowing non-compliance without actually saying that's what we're doing amount to the same thing as just overtly saying screw you? At some point, I think clearly we get there. I don't think we were there quite yet, but that curve is getting awfully close to the line.
You could have been both a lawyer and a Talmudic scholar. Kori, you were nodding. Do you want to comment on this? I had a different question for you, but if you would like to comment, you may.
No, I really value Rosa's analysis, and am thinking seriously about what she said. One thing that I think reinforces her main concern is the Speaker of the House of Representatives saying he didn't see any problem with the president spending or not spending money different than appropriated by Congress. I think that to me was a real danger sign, because if Congress doesn't defend its congressional prerogatives, I do think that's a constitutional crisis.
Oh yeah, no, Article 1 is in the toilet already, but the question is Article 3 in the toilet. That's where we stand in this. Well, I'm going to come back to you with something else, Kori, but Ed, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a question for Rosa about Elon Musk's role and what the courts say about this. I know they've sort of.
I think Ed is dreaming of Elon Musk a lot these days.
Nightmare would be the correct word. Yeah. But the fact that he's not even complying with sort of basic sort of ethics obligations, I mean, we all know, well, all of you, in fact, have been in government and, have had to, I don't know, sell stuff, declare stuff, do things you would not ordinarily do with your savings or your investments that are on a sort of tiny, minute drop in the bucket scale. With Musk, none of these apply. He doesn't have a constitutional role. He's not submitting himself to Congress. If Congress hypothetically demanded he come and answer questions about what he's doing, he would doubtless give them the middle finger. What does the Constitution say about that?
The Constitution itself doesn't really say much of anything about that. I mean, here's one of the problems that, the ethics and disclosure requirements, some of them are not mandated by law at all. Some of them are simply the executive branch, as a matter of policy, choosing to take on these obligations, and in some cases choosing to shed these obligations. As a special government employee, my understanding is that they typically file a short version of the disclosure form, the SF 450, which typically is not made public. We don't know whether he's actually filed that, but typically they're not made public. And as far as I understand it, I don't know that I'm not an expert on this, but I don't know that it is a legal requirement that he file it. I mean, here's our problem, right? The fundamental problem here goes back to, we get the government we deserve, right? You get checks and balances if we have branches of government that care about them. And we have seen over, the last century, and more, but particularly accelerating in the last few decades, is a steady expansion of executive power, a steady diminishment of congressional power, in large part because Congress has not been terribly interested in acting like a legislative branch. And so the president has enormous discretion in terms of what he can do. Unfortunately, it's not like Elon Musk is just some guy who walked in off the street, right? The president of the United States is saying, he's my guy. The president gets to decide who gets a security clearance. The president gets to decide what he's going to make public and what he doesn't, to a very significant extent, at least, right? And so I don't...
By the way, apparently they've signed some document that says that Musk's stuff is going to be undiscoverable by the public for another 10 years or something like that. There's some kind of special protection that they've granted.
Special protections for a very special government employee. But I mean, so this is a situation where it's not particularly clear that it's illegal, although it's clearly awful in a gazillion ways, the role that Musk is playing and so forth. It's an effort by Trump to bypass the various safeguards the executive branch has created for itself to protect itself and to protect the American public. We'll see. Obviously, there are all kinds of litigation now attempting to prevent DOJ from accessing certain kinds of materials. We'll see how successful those are. My big worry here, actually, if I can sort of pivot a little, because in some ways, I think the ethics disclosure stuff, or lack of disclosure, in some ways is the least of our worries. I'll tell you what I'm really worried about. As you know, the government took down, following these executive orders, a whole lot of web pages and data sets, particularly involving health, but not just within the CDC and NIH and so on, but sort of across the board, across executive branch agencies. Websites referring to any language that sort of vaguely suggested DEI were taken down. Whole data sets were made inaccessible. And we were told at first that Musk's Doge people only had read access to government files and to data sets and the Treasury Department's computer code. Then we were told, oh, actually, oops, he had edit access, but don't worry, he didn't use it. And now we're taking it away. I actually worry. Here's the really deep threat, right? Is the disappearance of facts, which then can get replaced by an alternative reality. That we've had the luxury of taking it for granted that our government doesn't just make things up. That when they say, well, here are the number of COVID cases, or here are the number of new jobs created, or whatever it might be, that they may be wrong. They may be counting in a way we might disagree with or something, but they're not just inventing stuff whole cloth, and they're not just taking stuff down because it's sort of politically inconvenient. I think we are, on the cusp of a terrifying new era in which they will do both of those things, and possibly even worse, right? I mean, just as, possibly even worse is sort of the replacement of real facts with potentially fake facts. And I think the sort of the ominous shot across the bow, and this isn't a fake fact issue, but it sort of moves in that direction, is, we're renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And we're not going to allow the Associated Press to, cover White House events because they keep referring it to as the Gulf of Mexico. It's just sort of taking language and just insisting that, you have to use the new language, you have to use the new facts, no matter what you think. And that's, we haven't quite gotten to a place that I could imagine us getting to, right? The sort of the evil genius for Musk of taking over the payments and the personnel system is, if you're a federal employee and you say, but, Elon, President Trump, you're doing something that is not lawful, you're told, oh, but you're on leave and your building access has been revoked and your computer access has been revoked. It's a really small step from that to, we can't even find you in our personnel files, or, no, we don't see any evidence that you're due a pension, and I do worry about that. I it's something I would have said was paranoid, a decade ago, sort of unimaginable that we would reach the point where that even seemed like a remotely plausible scenario. But now it does seem like a plausible thing.
Well, that's grim as hell. I have 2 1-minute questions, one for Kori and one for Ed. You can comment on that if you like. Kori, this question has to do with none of this, but I've been thinking about you as I've been watching all this unfold, and there are many chapters of it. Rosa mentioned the DEI thing. I saw that the Pentagon was not going to be recruiting at a Black engineering event, but was instead going to be recruiting at an NRA event. And I saw a bunch of sort of outcries from senior officers of color saying essentially they're going to pull back from recruiting military people of color. And this struck me as a potentially inflammatory mistake to make, given the way our armed forces are comprised. And I was just wondering what your reaction to it was.
My reaction is you are correct, David.
I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? It's going to alienate a huge portion of the military, isn't it?
So the services other than the Marine Corps have not met recruiting goals in the last couple of years. And that's probably largely because of unemployment being so low and COVID preventing recruiters from being able to meet with young people who have a proclivity to service. But they're worried enough about continuing to attract the 9% of young Americans who have an interest in military service that they have created like prep school programs to help them meet the physical and educational standards required. The Navy now gets 20% of its recruits through that program. The Army gets a full quarter of its recruits through that program. So it tells you how nervous the services are about bringing Americans into military service. And I think it's probably not a terrific idea to tell people who want to serve our country that they are unwelcome to do so.
No question about it. Hey, Ed, you know what? Here we are at the very end of this podcast. We've been talking for 34 minutes and 41 seconds. And we haven't mentioned once the fact that we have a new director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, which I think at almost any other point in the history of this decade-long podcast would have dominated our conversation.
Yeah.
Isn't this a sign that there's something deeper to worry about here? That it's like, oh yeah, and by the way, this woman who's kind of pro-Putin, pro-Assad, weird cultist, Edward Snowden defender, is now the director of national intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, where to begin with Tulsi Gabbard's biography? But the weird cultist thing is something that we really should pay quite a lot of attention to, because she remains a part of this Science Identity Foundation that is run by this autocratic cult leader, a New Zealander, who demands obedience, and who she hasn't renounced. And she was a key person that he singled out as one of the sort of crack troops of his weird cult. And remains a key person by according to recent reports. So there is that should not be overlooked in amongst all the extraordinary sort of statements she's made about Syria and Russia and the war in Ukraine over the years, echoed the talking points, about there being US biolabs in Ukraine and stuff like that. And of course, long meetings with Assad that her staff were shielded from, that they could not explain, and tried to get her to explain, and she could not or would not explain to them. Don't forget the weird cultism in her biography in amongst that. I'm astonished, though, at the fact only Mitch McConnell amongst Republicans voted against her. She stands against everything the party has until extremely recently believed in, including that Edward Snowden is a traitor, that she said he should be exonerated and repatriated back from Moscow. And she didn't really convincingly, in any sense in her testimony, repudiate that. And she's been voted through unanimously, minus Mitch McConnell, that well-known Berkeley radical, into her position. God help us. If I were at MI6 or the Australians, I would be reconsidering intelligence sharing at this point.
I'm sure they are. But look, at least you've given us a silver lining. Thank God for the profiling courage of Mitch McConnell. Thank God. Yeah. This is what stands. Once again, he has stood up for all of us, as we knew he would. Well, folks, quite a week. Clearly, the pace with which we went through issues there is a sign that there's probably much more to discuss, and hopefully we'll be able to do it with you guys again next week. Same for all of you who are listening. Join us on our daily. Join us on each of our shows. Join us with Norm Ornstein tomorrow, and right back here at DSR next Wednesday. Until then, bye-bye. Thank you.